Good morning, everyone. I'm Dean Glass, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's Penning the Past lecture hosted by Save Our Heritage organization. We have a truly special treat in store as we delve into the fascinating tale of Miles Minor Kellogg and the historic Encinitas boathouses, guided by none other than Rachel Brupbacher, who happens to be the great-great-granddaughter of the esteemed architect himself. Rachel's dedication to unraveling her ancestors' story and her meticulous research have breathed new life into Kellogg's narrative, resonating deeply with all who encounter it. Her journey to uncover the history behind these boathouses is a testament to her unwavering commitment to preserving her family's legacy and enriching our understanding of San Diego's architectural past. So, as Rachel leads us through the footsteps of Miles Minor Kellogg, let's celebrate the enduring legacy of this visionary architect and the timeless beauty of the boathouses of Encinitas. Please join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Rachel Brupbacher as she shares her insights and discoveries with us today. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Dean. I'm really looking forward to this. It's a great honor to be able to share Miles Minor Kellogg's story, but I would have to say that it's a tremendous understatement to say that I find it strange to be giving a lecture with the San Diego Save Our Heritage organization, or for that matter, to have written a book about two of San Diego County's iconic landmarks now on the National Register of Historic Places. I am not local or even from the West Coast. In fact, until a few years ago, I had never even set foot in California. But my family has a long history in Southern California. 4 generations lived and thrived there, 3 in Encinitas itself. My mother was the last. She was born in Los Angeles and raised in San Diego. This area was her home for many years until fate took her elsewhere. Her 2 children were raised on the other side of the country. She would tell us about California, though. Growing up, my brother and I would marvel at the sound of names like Loma Linda and Encinitas and Escondido. Where we lived, Spanish was seldom heard, so all of these names sounded funny to us. We thought of them as make-believe, like nonsense words from nursery rhymes or fairy tales. This changed in 2016 when my mother returned to San Diego to attend a high school reunion, and I decided to tag along. While we were out there, she mentioned that she had a hankering to see the boathouses that her great-grandfather had built up the coast in Encinitas. You know, one of those made-up places I'd heard about. I actually did know about the boathouses, a little anyway. My grandmother, Miles Minor Kellogg's granddaughter, had been a tireless genealogist and family historian. Once on a childhood visit to our house, she and my mother called me over to where they were going through boxes of old papers and photographs. They showed me an old newspaper clipping about the boathouses. They looked at me expectantly, curious to see what my reaction would be. I could sense quite distinctly that they hoped I would be impressed. I let them down. The grainy image didn't do the boathouses justice, and as far as I could make out, all I was staring at were a couple of boats. Big deal, I thought. You see boats everywhere all the time, if you live on the coast anyway. What was there to get excited about? My mother tried to explain that these were boats on land, something that was not really clear from the picture. But she and Grandma were on a losing streak. I still didn't get it. Boats, I reasoned, are often dragged onto land. So again, what was the big deal? That's when they gave up and I was allowed to go back to playing with my grandparents' exotic birds. All the time, the boathouses maintained a vague, lingering presence in my life. No matter where we went, my mother always seemed to be bumping into another Californian. They would get to talking along the lines of, "Oh, do you know such and such a place?" Inevitably, the conversation would drift to the boathouses. Amazingly, more often than not, the other person, a total stranger up to that point, had either lived in the boathouses themselves or else knew someone who had. It wasn't until the spring of 2016, though, that I saw for myself just how special the boathouses really were. It was nearing dusk, and I was drowsy from a long, traffic-filled drive up from San Diego. I peeled my eyelids open long enough to clamber out of the car with everybody else and snap a few commemorative photos. I was impressed. The boathouses were much larger than I had envisioned. In fact, they were enormous. And positioned as they are in a rise, they looked as though they were going to bear down on us any minute. I was only disappointed that we couldn't peek inside them. But it was only when I spied a wooden plaque off to one side that I really snapped to attention. Walking over, I saw Miles Minor Kellogg's name on it. It's amazing what a little thing like that can do. Suddenly, I was wide awake and began pestering people to take my picture in front of the boathouses. It still took a while, though, before I came to think of the boathouses as anything more than architectural oddities. What changed was that a few years ago, I inherited the vast Kellogg family archive from my grandmother. Just what a fascinating story this archive held, I had no way of knowing when I first started sifting through the materials. My grandmother's papers had gotten hopelessly jumbled over the years, and all I had to work with initially were random piles of meticulously labeled old portraits and snapshots. There were hundreds of them, scraps of paper on which she had jotted notes from her conversations with her many relatives, and most importantly of all, a couple of written histories. It was these two histories, written by Miles' wife Ruth and his eldest son, that were the greatest help at first in tracing my great-great-grandfather's life odyssey from his early years growing up along the coast of Lake Michigan, through his career building and proselytizing in rural Minnesota, to Boulder, Colorado, where he spent a decade building many of the houses that today grace that city's historic district and sell for millions, to his 5 dismal years homesteading in Wyoming, and finally to sunny Southern California. First to San Diego, where his older daughters worked in the fish canneries, and the whole family survived the Great Flood of 1916. Miles' children never forgot the flood, by the way, or how they stood at the fence watching horses being swept by the current and reaching out their own little hands to grab oranges or any other little delicacies that were floating by. But it was after the flood that Miles, to whom the natural disaster had been the last of many, many straws, moved his family up the coast to Encinitas. I had just one problem. Both of these written family histories stopped abruptly once Miles and his family reached Encinitas. I was on my own from there. Or so it seemed. That was when my grandmother, by then long dead, came to the rescue. She herself had grown up in Encinitas, and she had made up for this dearth of written material by interviewing as many of her 8 aunts and uncles as possible. All of them had lived in Encinitas. The first of these oral histories was the story of Miles' youngest son and namesake, Miles Justice, who lived in Encinitas from preschool age until he was about age 30. I listened in utter confusion as Uncle Miles rattled off a string of strange made-up sounding names. La Paloma, which I spelled L-O-P-P-A-L-O-M-A, Leucadia, and La Jolla. Everything sounded so foreign. I had no idea what Uncle Miles was talking about. He mentioned Paul Ecke, for whose world-famous poinsettias he helped build hothouses, and even this name meant nothing to me. Things became clearer as Uncle Miles wandered to more familiar subjects and names and described his high school years and talked about how, as a teenager, he had grudgingly helped his father build the boathouses in 1929. I listened to these oral histories again and again and again. Gradually, as I listened and studied old sepia snapshots, a picture began to form in my mind, until I felt quite uncannily as if I had grown up in the sleepy little coastal town of Encinitas myself 100 years earlier. The story of the boathouses, how and why Miles, prefiguring 21st century environmental efforts and without consulting any plans, ingeniously built them from recycled materials. He used coffee tins for the portholes. And his infuriated reaction to the early news coverage is rather incredible, as is his cross-country rags to riches to rags odyssey and the multifaceted career that he pursued as a builder, architect, carpenter, inventor, and businessman. But that story is already well documented in my book and is easily accessible now for the first time to the general public. So I thought I might instead treat you today to a glimpse of Encinitas, a tour of the town, if you will, as it was back in the 1910s and 1920s, in which Miles, as one of the key builders, played a starring role, and overtook the region before this way of life vanished forever. And also to introduce you to the remarkable and diverse array of men, women, and children who defined this way of life. This is what Highway 101, the old Camino Real, looked like when Miles and his large family rolled into town in the 1910s. Looking south, we can see the Hammond Hotel where the Kellogg's lived on the left. We can't fully appreciate the distances, though, until we view the highway from a sort of bird's eye view. Here we can see Highway 101 from about E Street on the left to D Street on the right. The ocean lies just over the rise beyond. The Hammond Hotel, one of the town's most important landmarks, is at left. Also known as the Pitcher House or the Old Encinitas Hotel, it was built or arranged to be built by the English-born settler E.G. Hammond on the corner of what is now Highway 101 and E Street. When Miles bought the building around 1917, there was still a large green bell beside it to mark the old Camino Real, and the original hitching post still stood outside the front. When they moved into the hotel, the Kellogg's became near neighbors of Miles' uncle, George Thibault. George was of French-Canadian descent and, like Miles, a native of Michigan. He had been among the first men to settle Encinitas. He was also, I learned from newspaper archives, one of the men who apparently helped build the hotel decades earlier in the 1880s. Among other things, George operated one of the first eateries in town, just south of the hotel. Jess Thibault, George's brother, and also Miles' uncle, was another noteworthy local. In fact, Jess was probably the most colorful character ever to live in Encinitas. I found it interesting how the press portrayed Miles as a kind of religious eccentric for having built the boathouses. This was unfair for a couple of reasons, but Miles probably made such an easy target partly because of the local reputation of his very eccentric Uncle Jess. Jess was a spiritualist. Spiritualism was extremely popular back in the 1920s, and Encinitas was a good place for spiritualists then. There was an entire colony based in Spooks Canyon where Jess was said to have made a table walk on its legs. Jess took things to an entirely new level, though, to the point that he later became the unpaid servant of a man who styled himself the Son of God. One of Jess's fellow spiritualists was a certain Mrs. Scott. Everybody, young and old, worked in Encinitas back then, and Edith Kellogg, Miles' daughter and my great-grandmother, sometimes hired herself out as a childminder or housekeeper. At one time, Edith was a nanny for the Gin family of publishing fame in Del Mar. But Edith also worked closer to home, including for Mrs. Scott. Mrs. Scott owned a Ouija board that she liked to have everyone try out. Edith was not keen about this, but she went ahead and tried it, only for the board not to work. Mrs. Scott said this was because Edith was a good Seventh-day Adventist Christian. Maybe she was right. Across Highway 101 from the hotel was a little homestead. This belonged to the Luxes, a family, or rather group of families from Luxembourg. One of the Lux boys, Pete, became the best friend of Miles Kellogg's youngest son, Miles Justice. The two boys were inseparable from a young age, and they got up to a lot of mischief together, including experimenting with guns. Pete Lux's father, also named Pete, was a hunter, and Miles Justice and Pete would help themselves to his guns. Once Miles Justice's thumbnail was blown off by the backfire of a 12 gauge that they had tinkered with. Another time, they set up a shotgun on the edge of the cliff overlooking the ocean and fixed it so that it would fire when they were out of sight. The shot went all the way down the beach. The two boys also shared a love of motors and built their own motorbike from spare parts that they picked up over the countryside. In 1927, they played hooky from Oceanside High School to see their hero, Charles Lindbergh, and his Spirit of St. Louis in San Diego. On a side note, someone mentioned to me once that they were surprised that Miles Justice and Pete Lux were friends, apparently because the Lux family was so poor. But the thing is, nearly everyone back then was poor. And the Kellogg's were not snobs. The family was nearly destitute when they arrived in Encinitas from San Diego. Something that I think we often forget today because we enjoy so many options is that in those days, people could not afford to pick and choose who they wanted to associate with. There were far too few people to go around. A child could count themselves lucky if they found a playmate their age who lived within walking distance. This brings us to another friendship. Near the Luxes lived the Roop family, who had migrated west from Oklahoma. James Roop and his wife Josephine were Roman Catholics. I was really intrigued when I found out about this because the Kellogg's were Seventh-day Adventists. And anyone who is familiar with Adventism will be aware that Adventists have historically looked upon Roman Catholics with great wariness. But once again, such differences did not get in the way of friendship. Miles and James Roop were evidently good friends, as were Dorothy Kellogg and Irene and Isabel Roop, and the two families frequently helped each other out. James' wife Josephine sewed Dorothy's graduation dress for Dorothy's mother, Ruth Kellogg, who was by then blind and unable to do it herself. James Roop ran a dry goods store along Highway 101 for many years. It included a lunch counter and even a pool table in the back. It was likely here that Miles Kellogg's son Lloyd and his best friend Waldo Lauer would go to shoot pool. They were little boys at the time and had to stand on boxes to reach the top of the table. It was while shooting pool that they met up with a bootlegger who persuaded them to sell his moonshine for them. They didn't sell it for very long before Miles found out, and according to Lloyd, beat up the bootlegger for involving the boys in an illegal enterprise. In 1928, this store was replaced by a new one that James Roop commissioned Miles to build in the then fashionable Art Deco style on D Street. We can still see this building, the Roop building, today. It is currently home to the restaurant Urban Sea. Some other family friends, the Coots, lived further from town. Today, people tend to remember Fred Coots' friendship with Bing Crosby more than anything else, but what always stands out in my mind is Fred's great love of animals. Fred was a dog trainer and would allow Lloyd Kellogg to tag along with him as a child when he went to a certain canyon at the crack of dawn to meet with movie people who wanted to buy his dogs either to perform tricks in the movies or to be used as personal pets by Hollywood stars. The Kelloggs loved animals too and took in stray cats and dogs. They even maintained a pet graveyard behind the Hammond Hotel. But the Coots family went in for more unconventional pets on their ranch. Here we have Fred Coots' daughter Mary, adopted daughter Maxine, Dorothy Kellogg, Isabel Roop, and Irene Roop. Hanging from Dorothy's and Isabel's hands is what appears at first glance to be a large teddy bear with fully jointed limbs. But it is actually the Coots' monkey. Besides the monkey, the Coots kept a pet skunk, which they had undergo an operation so that it wouldn't stink the place up. And then there was the raccoon. There's a funny story there. Lloyd Kellogg told about how the Coots left the raccoon unattended in the house one day. In due course, the raccoon discovered the taps in the bathtub and began to amuse itself playing with them. It got the water running and then, bored with the new game, found something more interesting to do and thought no more about it. When the Coots returned home later, they found their bathroom flooded. To repair the damage, Fred most likely called in Miles, who not only operated a plumbing store, but also a hardware store and electrical store. It was through his primary profession as a builder, though, that Miles made a lasting mark in Encinitas. Almost as soon as he arrived in town, Encinitas began quite literally to take on a new shape. In fact, Miles might be credited with building downtown commercial Encinitas. When Miles acquired the Hammond Hotel in 1917, he divided it into 3 sections: the top floor to rent out as lodging to agricultural workers, the second floor as his family's place of residence, and the first floor for his primary place of business. He carved out workspaces in the first floor, and that was where he operated many of his business ventures. Any remaining space was rented out to other local entrepreneurs. This included Al's Barbershop, whose original barber chair, incidentally, is on display at the San Diego Heritage Museum. In 1927, Miles added on to the back of the Hammond Hotel a stucco strip mall running along Highway 101. The strip mall, combined with the hotel itself, formed a kind of shopping complex known as the Kellogg building. This housed the office for the Coast Dispatch paper, the loan and building office, and the new location for Al's barbershop. Miles also built Encinitas' first silent movie theater and on the lot beside the hotel. He ran this for only a few years. When the La Paloma Theater opened in 1928 and ran it out of business, Miles turned the theater into a cafe. And this was all only along Highway 101. In addition to his commercial projects, Miles owned about 3 blocks between E and G streets. These he built up with houses, including the Boathouses. At one point, he was renting out as many as 20 houses on these blocks. Here are some pictures of a few of them. And on this one, you can see the masts from the boathouses in the background. Such hard work paid off. By the late 1920s, Encinitas had turned into a bustling modern city, almost unrecognizable from its humble beginnings as an insignificant coastal town. Much more could be said about Miles, and I have said most of it in the book. But since it is Miles himself and his legacy that has brought me here today, it seems only right that I should close with a few personal remarks about him and the non-material impact that he had on his adopted community. What I admire most about my great-great-grandfather has less to do with the countless buildings that he erected over the course of his lifetime. It has more to do with his character. To be honest, I can't say that I would have wanted to have met Miles myself. Miles was, as becomes clear in the book, a genius. And like many geniuses, he was a mass of contradictions. He was deeply religious and yet had a famously fiery temper and a colorful vocabulary to match it. That often got the best of him. Nevertheless, he got many of his priorities right. Miles was scrupulously honest and held others to the high standards that he set for himself. Encinitas back in those early days was a very closely knit community, and people had to try to work together to get along. Not everyone pulled their weight, though, and Miles was frequently left disappointed and disillusioned by neighbors who were dishonest. But he didn't feel that those kind of betrayals gave him the right to go and do likewise. Instead, he continued to give to his community and to make generous loans to friends and neighbors who found themselves in need, even to his neighbor Sid Chaplin, the older brother of movie icon Charlie Chaplin, who lived just down the street from the new residence that Miles built for himself and his family on 2nd Street. At a memorial service for one of Miles' daughters, someone thanked her for having taught her by example that people are more important than things. This was indisputably a Kellogg family characteristic. Miles was the sort of person who preferred to invest in a man or a woman rather than in a piece of new equipment to improve his business or to add to his ever-burgeoning real estate holdings. To serve others, the Kelloggs believed, was to serve God. There are many ways that I could sum up his life and legacy, but I think it would be most appropriate to quote the words of a woman whom Miles and his family respected highly. These words are now well over a century old, but they epitomize, I think, his character and philosophy of life. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold, men who in their inmost souls are true and honest, men who do not fear to call sin by its right name, men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole, men who will stand for the right though the heavens fall. But such a character is not the result of accident. It is not due to special favors or endowments of providence. A noble character is the result of self-discipline, of the subjection of the lower to the higher nature, the surrender of self for the service of love to God and man. This concludes the main part of my lecture today. If we have a few minutes more, though, I thought it might be nice to do a little show and tell to show you some heirlooms, some unusual knickknacks that Miles made and that no one outside the family, to my knowledge, has seen for about a century. Let's see. First up, we have this picture of a Great Lakes steamer. This was done either by Miles or his older brother Porter. However, Miles was almost definitely the artist. There's a reason for this. Those of you who are well acquainted with boats will realize that the Encinitas boathouses do not resemble ocean-going vessels. Instead, they look like the boats that sailed on the Great Lakes, where Miles was from. In fact, it was Miles' upbringing on Lake Michigan that inspired him to build the boathouses. He spent quite a bit of time working as a wheelsman aboard a Great Lakes steamer. And that inspired his lifelong love of the water and his ultimate decision to build the boathouses. Next, we have his pipe, which I believe he made himself. I mean, he made everything himself. He liked to use this to, let's see if you could see it well, to smoke allegedly buckwheat blossoms, but my mother says she thinks he actually smoked sage in it. So that's an interesting little knickknack. For those of you who have copies already of Miles Minor Kellogg and the Encinitas Boathouses, I talk about his fondness for smoking and his wife's great aversion to it on page, I think, 138. Yes. And then we have a really special item here. It's the most unusual heirloom, and I have to say that it is also my least favorite. Miles made this bronzed watch fob from his own bladder stone when it was removed in 1933. Yes, it's beautiful, isn't it? I talk about this on pages 139 and 140. As I said, Miles was a consummate recycler. He believed in, he never let anything go to waste, even his own bodily equipment. Just as he built the boathouses from a defunct dance pavilion and Encinitas' first theater from the Hammond Hotel, as you see. He liked to do that sort of thing. He liked to recycle. An interesting man, to be sure. So I believe that concludes what I had prepared to share with you today. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer or try to answer them.
Hi, thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I forgot to mention at the beginning, if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat feature. I see we have a couple already, so some people must have been here last month. We have, after all your research, do you feel a sense of closeness to Miles and Ruth Kellogg?
That's a very good question to ask. And I've actually considered it frequently because I knew 3 of their children, my great-grandmother Edith and her sister Vera, and also Uncle Miles Justice. And so you'd think that I would have some feeling of kinship, but for whatever reason, no. It's interesting because I can also contrast this with another experience. I wrote another book, let me see, yeah, about another great-great-grandfather of mine. He wrote the famous Arbor Day song, and he was an extraordinary man as well, like Miles, but in a very different way. I would have actually liked to have met Carl Milton Aldrich, but I think it maybe is just a personality thing, perhaps. So, and on the one hand, I feel like I did know Miles and Ruth, but I don't have a very strong feeling of kinship, I guess you would say.
Okay. Did Miles build any other unique buildings, houses, or structures based on a theme, such as the boathouses?
I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. Mainly what he did was recycling. That was what was quite unusual about what he did. Yeah, he mostly just built commercial and residential buildings. So.
Could you, oops, here we get some more coming in right now. Could you tell us more about the boathouses themselves, especially their interiors, square footage, room layouts, etc.? How livable are they, and why the two together on a single lot?
Okay. Well, Miles owned the lot. Um, and yeah, the boathouses really do have a fascinating story. I always struggle to give an abridged version because so many threads go into it. But what happened before he built them in 1929, he acquired some very oddly shaped lumber from a dismantled beach dance pavilion that he couldn't use for any of his residential or commercial buildings. And so he thought, what can I use this for? And he had always loved boats, and he had always wanted to build a boat. And his longing to build a boat, um, that really started in his young years in Michigan. As I believe I mentioned, he was very religious, and he became a Seventh-day Adventist as a young man in his early 20s. And he was very devout. And he had had an offer once to join a missionary expedition to Central America. And he could have been the wheelsman and in charge of the tents. So he could have built his own boat for that. But because he just started a family, it wasn't considered to be a practical choice. So he forewent that opportunity. And it wasn't until in the 1920s in California that he really got the opportunity to build some proper boats like that. And those were the boathouses. Now, in terms of their size, I think I spent a couple of detailed chapters talking about their dimensions. As I told Dean, it's been 2 or 3 years since I wrote this. So I don't have all of the details right on the tip of my mind. But let me see. But where the interiors are concerned, they're quite simple. I've been in one of them, the SS Moonlight, I believe. They're two-story. There's a kitchen. And one detail I really like is that there is a ship's ladder that is used as a pantry shelf going up to a skylight. So it lets in some natural light to the kitchen. They're really tiny closets. And yeah, so there's maybe a living area downstairs and a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen area, a staircase, you go up there, and there's a large living space there with some built-in bookcases. Yeah, so it's pretty basic. I'd love to say that they're just as fascinating on the inside as on the outside, but yeah, they're a little more exciting on the outside, to be honest. Yeah, I cannot find the dimensions. I know I have them here in the book, but maybe you could look online or get a copy of the book. Yeah, but does that answer all the points of the question, Dee?
I think so. I believe it did. We have one more question here. Does the bladder watch fob open?
No.
Brave enough to try.
I don't think so. No, let's hope not.
Wait, does anybody else have any other questions? Please type them into chat if you do. We didn't get very many. You must have been very thorough in your coverage.
Possibly. Let's see.
What we get here's one. What is the status of the house of the boathouses now?
So they were purchased by the Encinitas Preservation Association some years ago, and they succeeded in getting them placed on the National Register. So they had to get a very hefty loan to purchase the boathouses. They wanted to preserve them because there was off and on throughout the years, there's always the risk that they might be leveled and replaced with a normal house. So they are currently rented out as private residences, as low-income housing in Encinitas. The rent goes to helping pay off the loan. And they hope, I was told, is that one day when the loan is paid off, they can turn at least one of the boathouses into a museum, a local museum. Yeah, so that's how they are right now. I just wanted to see, I did find the information about the boathouses that someone asked. So they were fully outfitted with the amenities of more traditional homes in their approximately 1,100 square feet of living space. So yeah, that gives you an idea. They're not too spacious on the inside.
We have who are the boathouses built for? Two separate owners?
No, he just built them himself. He thought that their whimsical design would make them attractive to prospective tenants. Instead, what happened is that they became sort of an object of ridicule by the local paper, who likened Miles to a modern day Noah who had built the arks in anticipation of a second worldwide flood. And Miles didn't have, I think, much of a sense of humor. So that did not go down very well. And he wrote some other scathing letters that I copied in here. So they were just for to be rentals, like most of his houses on those blocks.
This has a comment first. Fascinating that you have relatives named Ruth and Dorothy. My maiden name is Kellogg. Two of my aunts were born around 1910 and named Ruth and Dorothy. My great-great-grandfather from around Chicago or Michigan area was named Albert, and my great-grandfather was Henry. My father planned to be an architect, but became a minister instead. Do you know why there is a Kellogg Street and a Kellogg Beach in Point Loma?
That's very interesting. I'm very interested in this person's genealogy. That is very unique. I wonder if there's some connection someplace in our family trees. Unfortunately, no, I don't know where the Kellogg association with La Paloma comes from. I don't think our Kellogg's were important enough for any of that to have been named after them.
Let's see. I think that's all the questions. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, did that one. Yeah, I believe that's it, unless anybody has any others. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, for such an interesting lecture. Wait a minute. We got another question coming in. Oh, somebody is saying I also have Kellogg's in my family tree from New York State. So I might have to put you in touch with some of our viewers today.
Well, our Kellogg's did come to Michigan from New England via New York. So it's possible there's a connection. Like I didn't mention this. This might be of interest to your viewers. I don't know how many of them are familiar with, well, everybody knows Kellogg cornflakes, right? And how they were invented by the two Kellogg brothers, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and his brother, Will Keith Kellogg. But they might not know they were designed as a health food for the Adventists Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan. And why I mention this is that the Kellogg brothers were Adventists, and Miles was an Adventist. And Miles did work on the Battle Creek Sanitarium in his role as a carpenter and builder. And he and Dr. John Harvey Kellogg considered themselves to be relatives. And people have tried to go back in the two family trees to establish what point of connection there is. And but it seems like there are some missing family Bibles and other things. So I'm just saying it gets a little bit complicated when you try to establish some of these links. Yeah.
Are the interiors of the boathouses built like boats to be very efficient, etc.?
That is a very good question. I am not a boat person myself, but the boats are not in any way designed to be seaworthy. The inside, I think, is basically just an adaptation of a regular house plan, but put in this unusual boat-shaped mold. So Yeah, I had a website that I operated for a couple of years. Maybe I should launch it again. And I shared lots of pictures of the interior of the boathouses. So if there's an interest, I'm putting up a new author website soon, and maybe I could establish a special page and people could look at those photos. Um,
Are you any relation to architect Kendrick Bangs Kellogg?
Not that I'm aware of. Um, in fact, the name doesn't really ring a bell. I'll have to look him up. The sound went off.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. There's
Okay.
some noise going on outside. I don't want to distract. It says that Kendrick Bangs Kellogg was very famous in the Palm Springs area.
Oh, okay. Um,
Oh, and somebody wants to know if Miles ever built boats rather than just boat houses.
oh, he did. He did. In fact, I think that this boat here, it pictures his granddaughter Betty, my grandmother, and he probably built that. He built boats to sail on Lake Hodges. I don't know if anybody knows where that is. And also, when he and his family were living in Boulder, Colorado, there were lakes there as well. And I believe he built boats to sail there as well. But they're more like, as you can see, rowboats, possibly sailboats, not proper boats with enclosed interiors like he had aspired to build as a young man.
Let's see if we get any more. Okay, I guess that is it for the questions. Okay, well, thank you, Rachel, for such an interesting lecture. And thank you to our audience, too. We hope to see you next month on the second Saturday for Penning the Past, Insights into San Diego's Historic Neighborhoods and Architecture. And remember that all the books discussed in this series can be purchased at the Marston House Museum shop. Thank you for your support of Soho and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Rachel.
Thank you, Jane.